Hello, my name is Margaret Buhr. I am the Director of Education at the Dubuque Museum of Art. I'm very pleased to be joined by artist Joyce Polance, whose exhibition Emotionscapes, Paintings by Joyce Polance, are at the museum through October 17th. Hello, Joyce. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
I'd like to begin with a brief introduction. Joyce Polance was a Chicago-based painter for over 26 years before a move in December 2020, accelerated by COVID-19, took her away from the Midwest and back to her home state of New York. Emotionscapes, Paintings by Joyce Polance, is a series of 14 oil paintings made since 2015. They express the artist's deeply felt emotions through the visual forms of landscapes and cityscapes. Her expressionistic paintings fuse realism with abstraction and focus on movement, energy, and emotion. Natural and urban landscapes take on human characteristics that reflect our uncertain times. Joyce was born in New York City in 1965. She attended Wesleyan University and received a Bachelor of Fine Art from the Fashion Institute of Technology. She has exhibited internationally and has worked in many private and corporate collections. If you are ready to begin, Joyce, I will turn it over to you.
I am. Thank you, Margie. And thank you to all of the staff, Stacy Peterson particularly, and all the staff at the Dubuque Museum for mounting such a wonderful show of my work. And I'd like to talk about my journey as a painter because I don't think you can understand the work that I have in this exhibition without kind of understanding how it evolved. And so I started painting really seriously in 1998 when I was living in Chicago. And I started out doing impressionistic landscapes. I had always loved Impressionism when I was younger. And so I did a huge series of these paintings. And you can see a couple of them here. The first one is called Autumn. And I think we'll have that up on the screen. And it's just an example of, it's a pretty straightforward expressionist landscape. There's a little bit of movement in it. I've always been drawn to movement in my work. But otherwise, there's nothing that's particularly experimental for me. A little bit in terms of the color. And it's funny, I think even in my Impressionist days, there was always a little bit of an expressionist influence where I would sometimes change the color. I have some paintings that have red skies and things like that. And I did those for a few years. And my painting, I started using larger brushes and incorporating some elements of the city as in my painting Dusk, which you can see here. But I still wasn't really changing. I wasn't really changing the sense of realism in the sense that the buildings are where the buildings would be, the sky is where the sky would be. But I was starting to break things up even more and get looser and looser. And I started doing even larger cityscapes that became more abstract. There's one called East from the L, which is from Chicago from the train, looking out at the bridges and the sky. And here's another one called Board of Trade, which is again the Board of Trade in Chicago, but you can see I'm getting looser and looser. And this is maybe by the early 2000s I was doing these, and I suddenly reached a point where I was done. And I wanted to do something different. I didn't know what it was. I started playing with doing some abstract work, and then I thought that I really wanted to get into the medium of encaustic. For those of you who don't know what encaustic is, it's painting with wax, and you mix pigment or paint with the wax, you melt it, and you use heat. So you iron the paintings, you can use heat guns, all kinds of things to melt the wax. And I love the surface quality you could get. This piece is called Vespertine. And it's hard to see in a digital image, but the wax is just built up in multiple layers, and then you could go in and gouge out sections of it and get thicker areas. And I really fell in love with working with the surface. And I suddenly was doing the figure. And that had come as a surprise after doing so many landscapes. but the figure was loose and the figure was getting lost in these kind of abstract spaces. And then as my work in Encaustic evolved, I think I was doing it for about 3 or 4 years. You can see another one called Those Ahead, Those Left Behind. This is a diptych. And one thing that was happening for me is I noticed the figures were starting to get more realistic over a period of time, as well as keeping these sort of abstract textural backgrounds. And one of the things I became aware of was that my favorite painter at the time was an artist from Britain named Jenny Saville, who did these huge nudes. And I started thinking, I was really drawn to painters who were doing really fleshy people. And it's very difficult to do that in caustic because the wax doesn't flow in the same way as paint. And I started thinking to myself, why aren't I painting what I love the most? And so I suddenly quit doing encaustic and went back to oil paints. And that was in 2006. And I started doing these very large nudes. They evolved, and I'm only going to show you a couple of them. The first one is called Spill. And I started doing these paintings that were about relationships among women. And the women were meant to represent different roles in family or friends, mother figures, sister figures, daughter figures. They could represent men. And I was doing these very intricate compositions. I would pose models and take photographs and then work. And these are large. They're 5 feet by 6 feet, most of them. And they would take me about 3 months to paint. And then I'll show you another one. It's called Guard. And I was really, really focused on the emotion of the characters that they were feeling, but they were meant to be interpreted in different ways so that the viewer could bring his or her own experience to the work. And so I was doing these paintings for about 8 years. I got very good at them. They have a real presence because they're so large. You walk into a room of them and you're kind of like, wow. And then I decided I was kind of done again. And I think part of what I was struggling with was because they were so intricate and I was focusing so much on the flesh and the figure, what I had lacked in these images was the movement that I had in my earlier work. And I was finding myself missing that. And simultaneously, as I had been drawn to the artists who painted large fleshy nudes, I found myself increasingly drawn to expressionist painters who did figures or landscapes, who were really altering things and focusing more on emotion. And I found myself wanting to do that kind of work. And I had no idea what it was going to look like because I'd been working in this way for 8 years. You develop a language as a painter and it gets comfortable and you get good at it. And then I kind of decided I wanted to do something different and I had no idea what it was going to be. And I had to kind of learn a new language. So the first thing I did was I didn't take a giant step. I first tried to think about the figure as landscape, which is something that's really in my work today. And I did a small series of paintings called Abstract Flesh, where I really zoomed in. These are on an unfinished canvas. It's about a 5-foot square. And I was trying to think of the figure as landscapes to sort of abstract certain sections of it. But the figure is still painted in a fairly realist manner. And then I started moving away from that. I started experimenting with flatter shapes and line. Here's a painting called Past, where you can see that I was still taking some of the realist imagery in the flesh, but yet changing the color more, adding some line. This is a piece about being tied to people from the past or people who are not in the room with you and still having it invade your thoughts. And so I was still using a narrative quality that I had been using in the figurative work. And this is obviously still figurative work. But I was really struggling. This is around 2014. And everything I was doing was different. And I was probably scraping out and getting rid of about half of what I painted. And I got to the point where I felt as if I had almost forgotten how to paint. And there's this piece, I explore themes of vulnerability a great deal in my work, particularly if you look at the nudes, particularly like the figures are very emotionally vulnerable. They're showing a lot of emotion, but there's also a vulnerability in the painting process, which is to me about remaining authentic in what I'm doing and being willing to fail, being willing to experiment. And so it was so hard to let go of what I knew I could do well and be that vulnerable. And in a way, it was a lot about letting go of control, because when I was doing the nudes, I had the compositions worked out in advance, so I just had to execute them. And there were challenges in the execution, of course, but it was very different than not knowing what was going to happen or where something was going to go. And I had to become willing to let go of that element of control. And the first painting that I did that really kind of worked for me, where I felt that I had been able to bring that into the work, was my painting in 2014 called Fragments. And in this painting, I actually had done this painting similar. It looked kind of like the last painting. It was a figure, and there were actually two other figures in the background. And I painted it in these sort of flat shapes of color that I was experimenting with it. And something about it I just wasn't happy with. And so I just said to myself, I'm going to paint over it. And no matter how good it looks, I'm going to be willing to destroy it. And so I painted over it. It looked pretty good. And while the painting was wet, I kind of just ran at it, literally physically ran at it with a paintbrush in my hand and just started kind of gouging at it and making these swirling marks and letting myself lose control. And it really worked. And I just thought, aha, now I have the answer to what I want to be doing. And that's never really the case, but it worked for a while. I did a large series of figures kind of like this, where I would just kind of put the figures in very thickly and very loosely and then kind of mess them up. And then I went back to the landscape. And this was the time where I started really going back and forth between the figure and the landscape, which I am doing to this day. The next painting I'll show you is called Black Sky. I did two versions of this. This is the one that's not in the exhibition. There's a painting that's very similar in the exhibition in Dubuque, and it's from 2015. And you can see I was using that same technique I was just using in that last figure, where I was really just sort of very quickly putting in with a lot of energy and emotion, just laying in a lot of thick paint and then messing it up. And the hope is that the energy and the emotion that I'm using when I'm painting translates into the work and moves the viewer. And so I'll show you a few pieces so you can see how my work started to evolve in the next few years. The next is a figurative piece called Swarm. It's a self-portrait, and I really started, you can see how thick the paint is. And I went into it with my fingers. Like most of those marks are my fingers, my thumb, my index finger, and just really started messing things up. And then I would bring what I would learn in the figure back to the landscape. Here's a painting called Tempest. And you can see, it's hard to see in the digital image, but I was using my fingers a lot in sort of trying to get that movement and that swirling motion, and starting to abstract more some of the things in the landscapes. So the images on the right, they're really cliffs and rocks, but they almost could be anything. They almost could be dancing. They could be some kind of figurative element that's moving. And as I started getting these elements into my work, I started feeling more and more like this is the right direction that I want to be going in. Here's another figure from that time, a portrait called Elapse. And I started really doing what I started doing in this piece and some other ones I was doing, and this is now 2017, aside from the thick paint and the movements and some of the abstraction, I really started playing with getting multiple colors on my brush or palette knife at the same time and letting them merge and letting them be muddy in places, and just to see what would happen. And then I'd like to show you a landscape. This is from late 2017. It's called Insomnia. This is a large painting. It's 5 feet wide. I struggled with this painting for months. I also struggle with insomnia, so it kind of reflected my own personal experience. But this was really a pivotal painting for me because in this painting, what started to emerge was the sense of there being not only abstract elements in the landscape, but that they were really coming alive. To me, some of the rocks in the front look like octopus or squid or starfish, or just, I was thinking sea creatures. The rocks are alive and they're in dialogue. To me, the ocean is in dialogue with the rocks and the yellow flowers, which could be anything. They don't necessarily have to be flowers. And so I was really getting to the point where I had the movement, the abstraction, and then the elements kind of coming to life and being almost individual creatures within the painting, all in dialogue with each other. And this really excited me. And I've basically been doing some version of this ever since, with variations, because I'm always pushing my work and always experimenting. And so the next piece I will show you is called Candy, which is in the exhibition. And this is from 2018. And so I'm doing some of that. If you look at the cliffs on the upper right, those were actually trees, and they kind of became dragons to me. And yet I was playing with what would happen if I would make the sky striped, or if I would add little abstract bits of color. And to me, it was just all about getting a feeling. To me, a work is done if it resonates with me emotionally in some way. And so it's not about the specific technique I'm using as much as that. The next piece is called Saint, which is also in the show. I did this right after I did Candy. And when I did Candy, I thought, oh, the striped sky is so cool. I'm going to do more of those. And this painting started out with a really striped sky, and it didn't work in this painting. And so, but I did retain some elements of realism in the clouds, and yet the mountains and the cliffs became striped. And I just kind of let it go where it would take me. And as you can see from the beginning, like, there are elements of movement and color and stuff that I've always used in my work off and on, that recycle all the time, but get used in different ways. And so they surprise me, but I have learned that just when I think I've got it down and there's a way I'm going to work, it never stays the same. The next piece is called Flourish, which I think it's the largest piece in the show. It was inspired by the gardens in Paris, the Jardin des Plantes. And again, if you look at particularly the trees on the upper left, to me, they seem to have faces. And they're all the bushes and elements in the garden are just moving together and against each other. I really like to have conflict where things are kind of butting up against one another. I think it creates tension in the work. And so for me, balancing something beautiful like a garden with something that's dark and tense makes the work just that much more exciting. I'll show you one called Swell, which is not in the exhibition, but I was doing some of those same techniques with the ocean, where the waves to me took on the characteristics of individual creatures, and they're all moving with and against one another. The next piece is Tumble, and this is in the exhibition. This piece I really struggled with. When you look at my work, if you see the show in person, the thicker the paint, the more the struggle. Because I just have to keep reworking and reworking. This painting started out as a scene of a little bit of a village with a mountain, and it had a stream. There were houses in the painting. And as I worked, that all wasn't working, and things really started to change. This was kind of a pivotal piece because I started doing things in it that I'd done to some degree throughout much of my painting history. But I really started treating the work more and more abstractly, So now the way I paint is I paint upside down, I paint sideways. I start out when I first lay the painting in, maybe using a representative image, maybe a photo I've taken that's inspired me, maybe something I've worked up on the computer from something. But once I lay it in, I just start turning it. I turn it in every direction and try to work it upside down and sideways so I can really focus on color and movement and abstraction. And great things happen, but then also you can really lose if I wanted something to stay representational or to stay a particular emotion or expression, it might be gone when I turn the painting back over. And that's okay. That to me is about taking the risks and being willing to be vulnerable in my art. And so this was one of those paintings where it just evolved into these kind of weird creatures forming into mountains. But yet, so I have all the movement and I have the abstraction. And it went in a way I never could have foreseen, but it's one of my favorites, so that's good. The next painting is called Dream City, which is in the exhibition. And this began as a way for me to think, I want to do something that's not actual landscape. I had seen a photo of the favelas in Brazil, in Rio, in the New York Times, and I started thinking, oh, maybe I'll do all these moving buildings. And I think I used about one or two buildings from the image in the bottom left corner or the upper left. And then I just scrapped it and just started putting stuff in and working the same way, turning the painting, seeing how things would happen together as they would move and interact. And that's really stayed with me. And that's the primary way I work today. I do experiment a great deal, and I can show you a piece that just kind of went off the rails in a completely different direction. It's called Schism, and it's probably the most abstract painting I've ever done. But you can still see if you look at the bottom, there are, like, the landscape is kind of screaming. There's still parts of it that are evolving, but yet it's really an abstract piece. And I thought, oh, I may do more of these, and then I really haven't, but it may come back because it does relate to what I'm doing. I don't have that much control over where it goes at this point. And it's really interesting to have worked so hard to let go of control in my work and then find out that now I've gone to the opposite end of the spectrum and I don't really have control over much of any of it. And that's okay, because it keeps the work really challenging and interesting to me as a painter. I'll show you Vault, which is from my exhibition. This is a painting that is a little bit different than some of the other ones. I had started out in spring, this is from 2020. I had decided I wanted to paint tulips just to do something really different. It was spring, I was feeling happy. I spent all summer working on this painting of tulips. I could not get it to work. And so I sanded it down a little bit and I painted over it. And there was so much thick paint that when I did this landscape over it, it actually came together really quickly because all that beautiful color showed through. Didn't have to do a lot to the surface. So that's sometimes a happy accident that comes out of the struggle of getting a painting not working. Simultaneously, I'm still working on the figure. I go in and out of it, but I've started a series of, I want to do about 10 of them, portraits that are 5 feet tall and really focus on movement and abstraction. To me, the dialogue between the figure and the landscape, I kind of feel like at this point, I can't do one without the other. I go back and forth and each informs the other. So this was the first one I did. It's called Memory. And as you can see, if you squint, it almost feels like a kind of an abstract landscape, but it's also, you know, there's a face in there and a hand. And here's another one called Cascade, which to me, the face almost feels like a waterfall. And these are an immense struggle, I have to tell you. Both of these paintings I worked for months on. There's so much work in them, but I worked them the same way as the landscape, turning them constantly, working upside down and sideways and just seeing what evolves. And I just always think about the movement. And if it moves me emotionally, and there's movement in the painting, I need movement on multiple levels, then it really works for me. And I will show you a few more. I think I have 3 more images. This is not in the exhibition. This is a very recent piece. I moved to New York, as Margie said. I moved to New York at the end of December, and the landscape here, there are just magnificent trees where I live, really inspires me. And yet I'm, doing those same things with like the movement and the emotion. And you can see there's almost a suggestion of faces that often appear in the landscape. Sometimes elements are screaming, sometimes they're quiet, but it's all just about the interaction of the elements to me. This one does not have a title. The next one also is in a similar vein. It's called Ghost. And this was the first painting I started when I moved to New York. And I didn't like the way it came out. And so I turned it upside down and completely painted over it. And this is what came out of it. And the last one I will show you is in my current show. It's called Uprising, and it's the same thing. The trees and the houses and everything. The elements of the evergreen in the center kind of look like eyes. There's mystery in it and movement, but yet it's intense and dark. And those are really the qualities that I'm going for in my work. And I think the last thing I will say before I go to questions is I talk in my artist statement a little bit about politics, not my own specific politics, but about what an uncertain time we live in, our polarized society, the chaos in politics, and just the polarized opinions of so many people. And especially interesting for me, having moved to an area where my political views are maybe different than my neighbor's political views. It's really a mix where I'm living now compared to Chicago where I was living. And it's very interesting. And I think my work continues to reflect some of that, some of the chaos that goes on in the world, not just in our country, but obviously throughout the world. And for me, just letting what wants to come out of me without really trying to control it is kind of my way of making a statement about authenticity and about how all we can do is just be ourselves and just kind of let it flow. And so it's sort of a quiet political statement that I make. I mean, even though my paintings are kind of screaming, so it's both. But that's sort of the social relevance of my work to me. And I hope that it also moves the viewer. And I think that's what I wanted to say about my work up front, and I'm happy to take questions.
Okay, well, thank you, Joyce, so much. I really liked your closing statement. I think that's something we all should aspire to. It's hard to come by, but we should all work for that, being ourselves, living in the moment. So are you ready to go ahead with the question?
Sure.
Okay, well, when I asked artists about the decision to become artists, many say they had no choice, that it was almost ordained. Others have a path that was less clear or direct, and I wonder, what was your experience?
Very indirect. I kind of went to art school. I went to college very young. I did not know what I wanted to do. I went to art school kind of because I was good at art. And I thought, well, I could be an illustrator or something. And I didn't have a huge painting background because I studied illustration. And then I worked a kind of a dead end painting job. It was painting needlepoint canvases out of college for a number of years. There was no creativity involved. I started working in glass. I taught myself fused glass. This is in the early mid-90s. And I did that for about, I did it for a number of years. And I still had that needlepoint painting job. It was right when I moved to Chicago. And I finally quit that job and out of the blue started wanting to paint. And it really took me by surprise. But I never looked back as soon as I started painting again. And I had to be that piece of letting go of that dead end job, which was sucking any joy out of painting, out of my life, that I made space to let this come in. And then it became, oh, this is what I want. And it was clear, but I was already in my early 30s by then. So I'm a very late bloomer.
Me too. So what about your work gives you the most satisfaction?
It works on multiple levels. I think there's obviously satisfaction in the challenge for me, because I'm constantly pushing myself to experiment and change. And then when something works, it's incredibly satisfying. But there's something about the process, right? I really put my emotions into my work. It's really an outlet for me. So that in itself is also incredibly rewarding. Somebody once told me about an artist that she knew who said, I could be famous, I could be doing this and this and this, but all I really want is this feeling I get when I'm just throwing myself into the work. And I think that's kind of it for me. There are moments when I'm working where it's just the most alive I almost ever feel. You know, I'm just throwing my whole body into it. I've got music going and just seeing what comes out of me. I know a writer I have a teacher, I dabble in writing, and I have a wonderful teacher who says, you write to find out what you know, not to write what you know, to find out what you know. And that's a lot of why I paint. It's like, oh, look what came out of me. I had no idea. It's kind of narcissistic in a way, in getting to know yourself, because all these unknown pieces come out.
Well, now, of art being such an immersive experience for you, how does it influence other aspects of your life?
It exhausts me because the way I paint is so physical. I'm on my feet and I do a little painting and I walk back and look at it, and I'm walking back and forth for hours. So, but I don't know. I think because it's such an outlet for me that it makes the rest of my life so much more satisfying, because I really get a lot out, and I take in so much from the process and the satisfaction. I think it just makes me a happier person.
Here's a just for fun question, Joyce. Name the artist, past or present, you would like to spend a day with.
Well, there are two of them. My two favorite painters, and you can see my strongest influence. My favorite painter of all time is Chaim Soutine, and my second is probably Willem de Kooning, and they're both huge influences in my work, particularly more so, and particularly in the last few years. If you look at my expressionist landscapes, which I have in this show, you can really see the influence of Soutine in particular. I'm different as a painter than he is, but the movement particularly, and the chaos, I really draw from his work. And I would just, if I could spend a day with either of them just to watch them paint, honestly, because as much as I know about painting, so often I can look at a painting and see exactly how it was done. But their work is so mysterious. And I know that they had to be I mean, I've read about Soutine throwing his canvases on the floor in frustration, and de Kooning sanding them down and going over them again. And it's so easy to go look at art, particularly expressionist work, which isn't pre-planned, to just think, oh, this artist is so great. They don't have the struggle that I have. They just did it. But knowing that how much these artists struggled, and you can really see it in the work, that intensity, sometimes the muddiness, the layering, the surfaces, you can see the struggle, and I really identify with that. And so I would just love to see them paint.
Now, you mentioned you dabble in writing, so this may be the answer to my question, but what work other than art making would you find as fulfilling?
Writing, yeah. I mean, I do write in my spare time, and I have a few published short stories, very few, but I really try to keep it as something that I don't put any pressure on myself with, because I have enough pressure with the painting. So I just do it for fun when I can. But I think I need a creative outlet, so it would have to be something in the arts, and writing is the one that calls to me the most, aside from painting.
Very good. Here's a few lightning round questions.
Okay.
What gives you joy?
So many things. Bicycling. I'm a hugely avid cyclist. Food, I have to say, really, I love food. And we moved back to New York State, and right now, wild black raspberries are in season, which I have a huge childhood memory of them, and I'm obsessively looking for berry patches and picking berries. And it brings me so much joy. But My friends, the people I love, my husband, you know, like I have a lot of gifts in my life. I feel really fortunate.
Very good place to be. Next question. This may not be the best question for someone who suffers from insomnia, but what keeps you up at night?
Insomnia. Yeah. I've had about a more than 15-year struggle with insomnia. And, but I have a very active brain, and my body tends to run physiologically, I run very hot. Like I have a hard time in hot weather. And I finally went to a doctor, an acupuncturist a couple of years ago, who said, "Oh, you have heat," which is a diagnosis in Chinese medicine. And he said, what it does is the heat goes up to your brain and it turns your brain on. And that's why you can't calm it down and go to sleep, because I have just a lot of thoughts at night. And so it can be about anything, but there's always something to keep me up at night.
Another question. What transports you to a different place? Maybe music, books, film, or something else?
Oh God, so many of the arts. I mean, I went to see a Soutine show at the Jewish Museum a couple of years ago in New York, and I literally wept in front of a painting of a carcass of beef. It was so beautiful. It's just like a cathedral. You just can't even describe how amazing the work is in person. And I'm a very sensitive person, emotionally sensitive, physically sensitive. So I'm very easily moved by things like a movie or music. Music, I would say, is the thing that moves me the most emotionally, probably. And it was why I always play music when I paint, because it really feeds the feeling and being in that vulnerable emotional state.
I know when I looked at your paintings in the gallery, there's a Rachmaninoff piece that came to mind, the Elegy for Piano.
I don't know that one, but the Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2. Do you know that one?
Yes.
That's my all-time favorite piece of classical music. I play it a lot.
Oh,
I love that
piece. Oh, moving piece.
Oh, love that one. So I'll have to look up the Elegy one.
Yes, I'll send you a link to it.
I love the Russians.
They're my favorites. The last question, one of the last questions you sort of talked about earlier about what you're working on now. So let me reframe it and say, what excites you about the future artistically?
I think just the unknown. You know, no matter how carefully I try to plan out something, I have no idea where it's going to go. And I'm working on this large series of portraits, the 5 feet ones. I showed a couple of in my talk, and I have maybe half a dozen of them done, and they're all different than I thought they would be. And I feel myself wanting to see what the new landscape will hold for me and where I live now as the seasons change. There's just there are a lot of things to be inspired by and to explore, and I have no idea where I'm going to go, and that's kind of cool.
The journey to the unknown can sometimes be the most exciting and daunting.
Yes, both. You're getting me when I'm in a positive place about it, but trust me, when I'm struggling with my work, I'm thinking, what the hell am I doing? Why don't I go back to nudes? A lot of people have told me to, by the way.
Oh, you might find your way back there. I don't know.
You know, never say, I don't think so, but never say never. If I've learned anything.
Last question is, how can viewers learn more about you and see more of your work?
Please go to my website, which is joycepolance.com, and feel free to contact me always with any questions or information about any of the paintings I have. If you're just curious, I have several galleries which are listed on my website. They should be, and I do have a gallery in the Midwest that has a bunch of my work in stock. It's mostly work up to probably not from the last couple of years, but Judy Ferrara Gallery in Three Oaks, Michigan. If you're ever on vacation in Michigan, go say hi, and Judy can pull out some of my work. She has some of my encaustic work and some of my cityscapes, even just some of the older stuff, and just from different eras, which it's kind of cool, and it's a beautiful gallery.
Oh, Joyce, thank you so much for sharing your artistic process and insights. I think I had a lot of fun. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And I can't remember if I said thank you at the beginning, but thank you to Stacy and Margie and Danielle, all of you at Dubuque for having me and such a wonderful show. And you've been great to work with. I so appreciate it.
Well, you're wonderful. Your paintings give visual voice to the changing nature of our emotional landscape in a very powerful and authentic way. And I think they encourage viewers to reflect on what they have both lost and gained during the challenging period of our recent past. Your work is at the museum through October 17th, and you can also view a virtual version of the exhibition on our website at dbqart.org. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.